Hello folks and welcome back to the Remember the Regulars YouTube channel. My name's Chris and I'm back again to kind of bang on about the now forgotten role of the Regular and Territorial Army and the Home Force in general. Um, so after my last couple of videos where I've introduced the Regulars and the uh, other forces that were deployed within the Home Forces and also looked at the kind of main characters, so the commanding officers who were responsible for commanding the Home Forces during the Second World War, I thought the best next step is to kind of provide a timeline of the key events that made up the Home Forces and their experiences during the Second World War in the UK. So this is based on my kind of personal experiences over the last 20 years. I've highlighted several key events and worked out a kind of very broad timeline of the main things and main events that happened during the Second World War in terms of the Home Forces. This is not a particularly easy thing to do, especially in terms of the entirety of the UK. So, the key thing with the Home Forces is that it's very easy to generalize and create a kind of very general story of their kind of experiences during the Second World War. But there was such a vast degree of activity going on at a local level that a one size fits all narrative is extremely difficult to kind of put together accurately. So when we look at the kind of like the top level stuff, so the commanders in chiefs of home forces, their overall and broad strategy is relatively easy to define over a specific period. But when we start to look at more local level, this defensive strategy was deployed in many different ways locally, and this was largely to do with the way the home forces were organised and administered, which we'll look at in a future video because it's relatively complex. But this means that today a kind of broad narrative is, you could put together a broad narrative quite easily, but trying to tell the story as it actually was is relatively difficult because of the complexity below this, at a local level. I'm kind of rambling a bit there and stumbling to put this into into something that makes sense. But at a local level, things were vastly different from what was going on at the top level, let's say. So a county and sub-county level, because of the way the command of the defences was split up and administered within the Home Force network. Defensive strategy was deployed and carried out in different ways across the country. The troops of the Home Forces, so the regulars, territorials, Commonwealth and Free Forces, were deployed differently within this defensive network. And yeah, there's a vast amount of variation. Defensive strategy changes as well very frequently. So every couple of months you see changes to the standing orders, for example, at a local level. So this is my best attempt at putting together a timeline of the key events of the Home Forces. And kind of in line with that, I just thought it's best to focus on, the kind of key events of this and look at how defensive strategy changed, but also kind demonstrate that the timeline of events that many people seem to acknowledge and understand today is vastly different from what was actually going on. So this timeline is based on, like I say, my own research. I've put in some key sources of information here just to prove that what I'm saying is not complete bull, which is something that's rarely done by others. And the aim is here to show that what's readily accepted online and elsewhere is not generally what happened in reality. A key point here to make as well is that in hindsight, a lot of people would dismiss some of the things, especially in terms of like the threat of invasion. Is it readily dismissed without essentially no historical basis? Which is one of the key reasons why it's vitally important to consult period documents, as I'll show in this talk. And things like the actual threat of invasion is relatively very often purely dismissed out of hand, often based on hindsight and the fact that we know the Germans didn't actually invade. Well, when you start to look at the documents and what the Home Forces were, the orders they were issuing, the assessments they were doing of the intelligence they had, it becomes abundantly clear that the threat of invasion was taken very seriously, for example, and also lasted much more extensively or much longer than many people realise. It's often dismissed that as soon as the Germans turned their attention to Russia in June 1941, the threat of invasion dissipated, while, as we'll see in this talk, that is simply not true. I'm also going to kind of basically do a very basic coverage of like the how the role of the Home Guard evolved over time. So in comparison to the regular army and the territorials, etc., etc., the role of the Home Guard is relatively well, not the role of the Home Guard, so the timeline of the Home Guard today is relatively well known. But the reality is that this timeline doesn't necessarily reflect what was actually going on in terms of actual military organisation. And again, with the Home Guards, it's extremely difficult to create this very broad narrative because of the vast disparity in how they were um, commanded and deployed within the home forces by the divisions and battalions of the regular and territorial army, etc., etc. So in some areas, the Home Guards, as soon as they were equipped and had a relatively decent amount of training, they were given in some areas given kind of vital tasks within the home forces. In other areas, they were told to essentially shut up, stay out of the way, and not get into trouble and not harm the work of the regular army. There's a massive amount of variation across the entirety of the UK, which is something we'll cover at a later day. We'll look at some examples of how the Home Guard were deployed within the Home Forces, their actual role, and how this role potentially changed based on where they were located in the UK and as the war progressed. But that's kind of enough of me rambling. Let's get into this. So let's start with a definitely accurate timeline of events. So this is obviously a bit of a joke, but from my experience, this is how the kind of like home force and the timeline of the Second World War in terms of the defence of the UK kind of progressed. So in 1939, war was declared in September. Nothing much happens till 1940. Then in 1940, you get the invasion of France. So you get Dunkirk, little ships, Home Guard formed. When the Home Guard are formed, they are just sent out with pitchforks and kitchen knives tied to broom handles and given the task of defending the entire country, while the army that's been pulled out of Dunkirk goes off to lick its wounds, has a bit of a jolly to recuperate, and disappears for a couple of years, apparently. Coming into 1941, the invasion threat is almost immediately over in middle 1941 when the Nazis invade Russia and turn their attention to the east. So that's the invasion threat over after just over a year. Nothing happens in 42 or 43. D-Day happens 1944. In 1944, 1945 the war ends, and then from 1968 to the present day, Dad's army. Obviously, this isn't true. This isn't an accurate timeline of events, but I just put that in there because I didn't get to use this slide when I was going to do all my other talks a couple of months back, and I just took this out because it took a bit of time. But anyway, that's from my perspective what we generally see as the key events of the home forces and the home defence, for example. Obviously, it's not true. So let's break that down. So, although I'm just leaning back in my chair, I like this chair. Today, the threat of invasion is seen as only starting when the Germans decide to invade the Low Countries and France. So yeah, France, Belgium, the Netherlands. As soon as the Germans invade, that is perceived today as when the invasion threat starts, which is not true. The invasion threat, in terms of actual history and the Home Forces and the War Department, starts almost immediately upon declaration of war in September 1939. So in October 1939 even, we see the Julius Caesar plan drafted and implemented to counter the invasion threat. So the main invasion threat at this point was the almost immediate threat of invasion from ports in northern Germany. So there was a belief and a perception or a possibility as well that based on the intelligence that the Germans could set sail from ports in northern Germany and invade the country almost immediately. To counter this, as we saw in my previous video, so the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces at this time was General Walter Kirk. Walter Kirk? Anyway, General Kirk. And his plan involved deploying units of the regular and territorial army. Worth pointing out, in 1939, the Home Guard didn't exist and wouldn't exist for another, 8 or so months. So this saw the deployment of mainly territorial army units across the UK, primarily in the east of the UK, to defend what were seen as vulnerable ports on the coast. So the idea or the assessment of the threat of invasion was that the Germans would land, capture a port, and use that to kind of fuel the invading force that made landfall. Anyway, something I'll cover in more detail later, because the change in threat of invasion as seen through the documents is really quite interesting and cool, and not something that's generally looked at. So This is the Julius Caesar Plan as it was issued, and this is just like a broad introduction to this document that outlines the Julius Caesar Plan. This is a really quite cool thing to look at as well. So I'll let you read this in your own time. If you want to pause it, I'm just going to try and take a quick look. But this is what the Julius Caesar Plan entailed. So although today the defence of the UK is largely seen as being undertaken by the Home Guard. At the outbreak of war in September 1939 and the formation of the Julius Caesar Plan in October 1939, there were a vast number of units of the regular and territorial armies deployed within the UK under the Julius Caesar Plan to protect the country. So from this document, I've calculated that there were 20 infantry divisions. That's a lot. If I can't remember how. Well, I can't work out. I didn't think to work out how many that actually is, but I might come back to that. I'm gonna have to come back to that because I can't remember how many troops are in a division. Anyway, it's a lot. There was also one armoured brigade deployed within the Home Forces under the Julius Caesar Plan, and also one armoured division. So that's a fair amount of troops considering that at this point war had just been declared. They've mobilised over 20 infantry divisions and deployed them within the UK to defend the UK against this perceived threat of invasion, which gives you an idea of how seriously this was taken. Anyway, story for another time. We move on. Coming into 1940, there were various invasion threats, not just to the coast but also the inland areas throughout 1940. And again, this is something I'll cover in more detail later because it's going to need its own talk. So although today the south coast is seen as the main area where invasion was going to come, because in hindsight we know Operation Sea Lion would have seen troops dropped on the south coast. At the time, obviously, the commanders of the Home Force and the Home Force themselves didn't know where the invasion was going to come. They didn't have access to the Operation Sea Lion. You never hear about Operation Herbstreise or Autumn Journey or something like that. Autumn Trip is what it translates to, which would have seen diversionary raids on the east coast with troops dropped off in parts of East Anglia and as far north as Scotland. But you don't hear about that. It's all on the south coast. Anyway, following the fall of Denmark and the fall of France, there were multiple threats and the fall of Norway, there were multiple threats of invasion to the coast throughout 1940. And to summarise, it was pretty much the entirety of the UK that was at threat of invasion. And again, this is always dismissed as, the Germans weren't going to do it. It would never happen. The commanders-in-chiefs of Home Forces could not take anything at chance. They could not risk leaving sections of the coast and inland areas undefended. It wasn't feasible because the invasion threat could have come from anywhere. Anyway, as I covered in the video where we looked at the commanders-in-chiefs of Home Forces throughout 1940, there were also major changes in defensive strategy. So when Kirk is relieved of command, there's a change of strategy as Ironside takes over. When Ironside is relieved after 2 months, his well-known and quite famous stop-line strategy ceases to exist as he is replaced by General Alan Brooke in July 1940. So stop lines, although everyone bangs on about them, they were massively temporary. But coming back to this idea, or this, not an idea, this thing that defensive strategy changes at a very local level. In some cases, like in East Anglia, for example, the construction of stop lines, or the defences associated with stop lines, more accurately, continued into January, February 1941. In most cases, this was because a lot of these defences would then be required by the defences that were going to be created focusing around nodal points. Again, story for another time. So 1940, this is when we also see pillbox construction starts on a wholesale level in about June 1940. So a lot of people seem to think that pillbox construction started as soon as the war was declared. It didn't. Anyway, what we look at in more detail. Coming into 1941, obviously today we know the invasion did not come in 1940. So the intelligence picture suggested to the Home Forces that invasion was going to come in September because the tides would be favourable for this, for example. Obviously this didn't happen, and the Home Forces then assessed over the winter of 1940-41 that the invasion wasn't going to come until 1941. So this gives the Home Forces some respite. Coming into 1941 and over the winter of 1940 and 41, we see the consolidation of the defences that were built between June and August 1940. So we see like things like the The coastal crust defences, there's more effort put into bolstering those and making them more formidable. And we also see further construction going on as well. Inland areas, we see the shift from stop lines, linear defences to nodal points, anti-tank islands, etc. Undertaken as well. So there's this massive consolidation of defences, ongoing training of troops, of the home forces, and a vast amount of change going on throughout 1941 in terms of defensive strategy. A lot of this focuses around reorganisation of the regulars and TAs, so we see a lot of the regular and territorial army units and the Commonwealth Force and the Free Forces redeployed, moved elsewhere within the UK, and they continue to undertake training. And we also see things like the introduction of new weapon systems, such as like the Blacker Bombard, better known as the Spigot Mortar. Although this is often seen as being issued solely to the Home Guard, it wasn't. It was also issued in vast numbers to RAF units defending airfields, later the RAF regiment, and also the regulars and territorial army units as well, in particular those defending coastlines and nodal points. So although the Blacker Bombard was issued in large numbers to the Home Guard, it was also issued in large numbers to the regs and the TAs, but that goes forgotten. And this, issuing of weapon systems and new weapon systems like the Smith gun in 1942 continues over this period. And then it's towards the end of 1941 that we start to see the Home Guards being better organised and better trained. So after a year of organisation training, this is the point where the Home Guard have become a more efficient fighting force and not the bumbling idiots that we see presented in Dad's army. In some areas as well, towards the end of 1941, we see them given more responsibility for localised defence. So in 1940, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because I want to cover this in more detail in a separate video. But in 1940, the Home Guard are literally static. They are tasked with defending literally their immediate locality, so a village or a small town, for example, alongside or behind the regulars and TAs. Coming into 1941, for example, in Yorkshire, in East Yorkshire, the Home Guard start to be given additional responsibility to undertake mobile counter-attacking roles next to and alongside and behind the regulars and TAs. So that in some cases they're incorporated into local counter-attacking plans in 1941, for example. But again, there's no one-size-fits-all story or narrative to this. In some areas they were given no responsibility whatsoever, and their role continued as it was in 1940. Anyway, general broad timeline coming into 1941. 1942, things started to get interesting in terms of pillbox construction. So in February 1942, pillbox construction is officially halted. In some areas, this has stopped as early as August 1941. So again, there's no one-size-fits-all narrative. The order that was issued we'll look at in a second, but yeah, pillbox construction was halted after an 18-month period. So again, everyone seems to think that pillboxes were constructed from 1939 all the way up to the end of the war. The pillbox had a very short and finite shelf life before it became officially obsolete. So when you hear stories today of like, oh, they should reuse pillboxes, they were obsolete in 1941, they're still obsolete today. They were, as we'll see in a second, replaced. And then coming into the end of 1942, in December, this is when the immediate threat of invasion is considered over, as we'll see in a second. So today you hear, oh yes, the Germans turned their attention to Russia, so therefore the invasion threat was over. Not true. The War Department, the government, saw that the threat of immediate invasion continued way after that period where the Germans had turned their attention east, as we'll see in a sec. Right. So in terms of pillbox construction, this is the order that was issued from well, this is an example of the order within the headquarters of Southern Command, but this came from the Home Forces, as you can see, was issued to various commands here. And this refers directly to the construction of pillboxes and gives you the reasons why pillboxes were declared as obsolete, which if you zoom in and have a look, have a read through it, main reasons were that pillboxes were no longer capable of withstanding current and future German weapons, for example, and to make them be able to withstand things like artillery and direct fire and things like that, they would need to be increased in size and thickened to the point where they would become so obvious in the landscape that their purpose is pointless, because you can see them miles off. And it's recommended here that they were to be superseded by well-concealed slit trenches and earthworks and small defended localities of trenches, which again you don't hear today, although the trench made up a significant amount of the anti-invasion defences constructed. In most cases, the trench vastly outnumbered the number of pillboxes built. Today, the trench is forgotten, even though it superseded the pillbox. Anyway, 1942, February 1942. No, February 1942, pillbox construction is officially halted as outlined in this document. So, as I've already mentioned, in December 1942, there was an assessment undertaken by the War Cabinet to assess the threat of invasion coming into 1943. So this document is available through the Cabinet War Files, through the this reference below, and it's well worth reading. So this was issued, like I said, there was a meeting held essentially in December 1942 to assess the coming year in terms of the threat of invasion. And it was decided during this meeting that, the question was asked, is the invasion of the UK likely to be attempted in 1943? And it was determined that it was vastly unlikely that this was going to happen. So the kind of conclusion was that, as long as they don't reduce the forces in the UK, so the Territorial Army, regular army, that, the Germans would were very unlikely to attempt invasion in 1943. They also mentioned later on in this document as well that the organisation is to be put in place that if the threat of invasion does become imminent, and likely again that the regulars and TAs are going to be deployed across the UK as part of the Home Forces again, as they were in 1940 and 41. So this is a document well worth having, but clearly outlines that the War Cabinet, the Home Forces, the War Department saw that the invasion threat continued way after the invasion of Russia in 1941. I'm no good with dates, so I apologise for that. I'm no good with numbers, but anyway, you get what I mean, I'm sure. So this is the actual picture. So today everyone goes, oh, the invasion threat was over by June 1941. The reality is that this is what the documents say. The documents say very clearly that the threat of invasion was over by 1942, 1943. But there were things in place to change that just in case the situation changed. So, bringing us into 1943, 1944, it's 1943 that the Home Guard are given more responsibility for defence of the UK. This essentially helps to free up the regular and TA units for deployment elsewhere and further training in preparation for the invasion of France. We also see coastal defences reduced significantly. So at this point, when the Home Guard take over things like anti-aircraft batteries, coastal artillery batteries, they didn't have the responsibility of defending the entire coastline as the regular and territorial army had from 1939 up until 1943. They were solely focused around coastal artillery batteries, for example, in terms of coastal defence. So it's not until almost, let's say, 3 years after the Home Guard are formed that they get an almost primary responsibility for defending the UK. But as that document from the Cabinet, the War Cabinet, outlined very clearly, the Home Guard would clearly be superseded if the threat of invasion became more serious again by the regular and territorial army. So, yeah, by 1943, the threat of invasion is over officially, and this is at the point where the Home Guard are deployed for defence as a primary fighting force, by which time the invasion threat is pretty much over. But they do vital things such as taking over anti-aircraft batteries, for example. In some areas they've been operating Z batteries, which are these rocket batteries which fire out barrages of rockets that explode in the air, much earlier than this. But again, there's no one-size-fits-all narrative. This is the broad picture, as accurate as possible. But yeah, it's 1943 when the Home Guard get their time to shine, essentially. Coming into 1944, we see the demolition of anti-invasion defences ramping up. So this had started in some areas as early as late 1941, where some anti-invasion defences were abandoned. 1943, some anti-invasion defences are demolished. But in 1944, in particular in the south, this is undertaken on a more wholesale effort, in particular on the south coast, to free up areas so that the troops under Operation Overlord could be deployed more effectively, for example. And coming into December 1944, this is when the Home Guard are disbanded. So they get like almost just over a year or so, let's say 2 years, as the primary defensive force of the UK, and they are disbanded in December 1944 because they are no longer seen as required. So yeah, that's the kind of very broad thing. Let's just have a quick look at what the Home Guard were doing again. So this is a really nice photo taken at, I think it's Hornsey in the end of 1941. And this shows the kind of thing that the Home Guard were doing. So yeah, taking on the operation of coastal artillery batteries, anti-aircraft batteries and the like. What's really cool about this one is the caption for this IWM image shows, yeah, so this is Hornsey, so one of my areas I'm looking at in East Yorkshire. So this battery was operated by the 350th Coastal Artillery Battery Royal Artillery, not the Home Guard. But the key point here is the date of this was taken in 42, 20th of the 1st, 1942. So the 20th of January, 1942. So the Home Guard are receiving training. They are not given the primary responsibility for operating this battery, for example. And it's worth pointing out here is this makes this caption makes it very clear, in an emergency. So the Home Guard have been trained in an emergency to be able to man and fire the guns in this sector. This was just one example of this happening a bit earlier than 1943, but it's by no means universal in terms of the Home Guard taking over coastal defences. And as this caption makes it abundantly clear, the Royal Artillery still had primary control of this battery as well. When you look into the records for coastal artillery batteries, for example, more often than not you see 1943, 1944 is when they were handed over to the Home Guard. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the role of the Home Guard later in the war. So that's been 25 minutes as always. That's been a kind of very, very broad timeline of the main and key events that made up the anti-invasion defences of the UK, in particular the Home Forces. Hopefully that gives you a better idea of what was going on, but as I need to keep on stating, there is no one-size-fits-all narrative. This is the best I can do in terms of my research and basing it on the facts and the original documents that I've seen and have consulted. But when you start to dig into things at a local level, you see a vast amount of variation. But hopefully this gives you a much better idea of what was going on, the role of the Home Forces, the role of the Home Guard, and the key events in terms of how the Home Forces were organised. So yeah, I hope that's been useful. Cheers for watching. I'll see you later. Goodbye.